Hello, this is Alan from the Mokono Man at YouTube with another 3D printing video. Noko Shikanoko from My Deer Friend Nokotan. Free to download anime garage kit from Colts 3D. This collection was nicely done in 12 pieces with keys. Check them out on the slicer, hollowed, placed drain holes and supported. 8-hour close to 200mm print. Using Jayo standard resin, flash colour, thoroughly shaken. I find I have even less adhesion issues by pre-soaking the bed before printing. In conjunction with the heating band, further experiments needed. Stirred it all up and confirmed it was over 30 degrees. I'm currently using the Anycubic Mono X 6K resin 3D printer. Exposure and slicing settings is pretty close to factory settings with the UV power output winded down to a fraction in favor of a slightly longer exposure time. More info on the printer's setup and review video. The printed pieces were drained out and pried into a metal container. They are grouped together using a support mesh, which is an experiment on greater bed adhesion. All the pieces were washed and soaked in methylated spirits or denatured alcohol for Americans, reclaimed with a funnel for future use, then cured using natural UV light. Depending on time of year and weather, this is a longer process and could be left outside for up to a week. It is flipped to make sure all parts are cured properly. Post-print weight is always heavier than the slicing recommendation when doing quotes. Being mindful of support placement, I am very happy how this came out. No distortion and very smooth layer lines with crisp detail. Very successful. To remove the supports, I brought a pot of water up to boil in a container. Then soak the parts at the support and raft level, not at the part level. This softens it enough that it peels off with a great amount of ease and without damaging the main part itself. Some have made the mistake of submerging the entire part and destroying detail or crushing it. If you have part warpage, you have the potential of soaking the entire part and pushing it back together, but there are risks. Unlike using hand tools, I'm also not left over with nubs and pock marks that needs to be trimmed, sand and filled later. The supported surface will still have the most amount of flaws and will require some sanding and correcting and will not necessarily show up well in paint. When orientating the model, this should be considered. On that very note, and with all the parts laid out, we'll resume to test fitting and sanding. To speed up the process, I'm using a Dremel at a low speed to gently grind everything down to a flat level. Then with 2 and 400 grit sandpaper, polish it down to a smooth surface wet. I'm working bottom up, especially with the test fitting and deciding on color separation and what to glue before and after painting. I like the supports to be where the surface of the model will not be seen, like the bottom of the soles of feet and joints. I also find with 3D prints like this that the tolerances are far too tight and they don't necessarily friction or snap fit. I'm going to be widening the holes and slimming down the pegs to allow for a precision fit and space for glue and adhesion to hold together. This adjustment is kept being made until I get a flush fit and can move on. One of the assembly decisions made was adding the socks, the legs and the shoes into a single part and filling the component homebrew seam filler putty, much like Tamiya Basic type. It'd be much easier to paint the legs, mask off and do the socks and hand paint the feet than it is to pin and glue later. I want it to be supported under its own weight and not have too many issues around the ankles and lower portion of the legs. Expanding upon the sanding component, I laid out 3 fresh pieces of sandpaper and would dip them periodically in water to collect the dust. This is just a medium to light pressure casual wiping across the entire surface area in hopes of eliminating any leftover layer lines or debris attached during the resin printing process. Resin dust is carcinogenic and very harmful to breathe in. Wet sanding does collect it and filter it through in the water, which gets thrown out later. For the grinding component, I did have ventilation running while wearing a respirator. I'm sitting on a wholesale box of construction adhesive and experimenting it with modeling, liquid nails. Been decanting some on paper and applying it with a Q-tip. Takes a while to dry, but it does dry rock hard. It's not very sticky at first, nor clamps the parts together like super glue or plastic cement, and the figure will need to either be well pinned or stand within its own weight, which is a bit of a balancing act with widening holes and slimming down pegs. Covering the tip with plastic or rubber like Glad Wrap and a glove will keep it fresh for months, even a calendar year. The arms and head were glued on with a little further putty work and sanding. The overall test assembling came out great and was able to stand. I was so confident and sure of my sanding, grinding and printing work, I'm going to paint straight onto the surface without primer. I'm using a mixture of hobby and automotive paint, all lacquer, thinned with automotive lacquer thinner to a viscosity where it's transparent after sticking in a clear shot glass being swirled around, thoroughly stirred, and poured into a new airbrush I've recently acquired, a knockoff of a Badger Sotar 2020 double action gravity 3.3mm nozzle through a very small portable plastic compressor at around 11-12 psi pressure. Most of the components will be shaded in 3 tones of colour, especially the skirt being outlined for definition and the effect of light cascading down in gradient. Immediately not super noticeable, but it does add more definition and storytelling atmosphere to the finished product. A promotion from a flat, basic, single color toy plastic luster to something that's a bit more in scale and real in the room. Capturing this in anime is tricky, but I did this one pretty quickly as I have a few garage kits under my belt. Moving to the flesh, I'm very excited that I've got some custom colors mixed from a automotive paint manufacturer, especially for me. They're of a very high quality. It was incredibly smooth and butter-like to spray, and most importantly, it was incredibly and ridiculously cheap to get made. $10 for 100 ml. A little bit thicker than what you get from Mr. Hobby, starting at a tan coat for under the knees and around some flesh folds and building up with flesh and flesh mixed with white. My assembly and the figure breakdown's a bit basic, so we masked off the face, hands and some detail and built up white with a few light grey shades, and finished off with all the other components like the hair and the uniform tie. Not just airbrushing, but many features were also hand painted. Most notably the face with a fine brush, picking out the outlines of the eyes and colouring in the whites and adding the multiple layers of circles to make the iconic very round and glintful iris and eyeball. Smaller deep fold detail like the shoes, lines and detail on the uniform scarf, undergarments which aren't really noticeable. Lastly, the antlers, which was somewhat very satisfying to paint. I've flatly done with no shading, first by outlining the confines of the area and then filling in. Also done in lacquer paint, which isn't super ideal, but if there's any strokes and lumps I would spray thinner on top to mellow and flatten it out. After everything dried and thoroughly chemically hardened, I used building epoxy to finally put everything together step by step, finishing off with a matte clear to dull everything down with no sheen. Natural state for flesh, hair and clothing. The eyeballs glossed up a bit by hand. Here's the finished result, and I'm pretty happy with it. It was a reasonably quick and easy build, but I put more effort into documentation and editing of this video. If you enjoyed the insight of my process or learnt anything, it would be much appreciative for a like or comment, only if you feel inclined. I feel I've really found my own way and process in 3D printing and come a long way from the Spark Maker, and definitely very excited to do more and felt that I've done this particular character and the 3D sculpt justice. This concludes the video. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. The link to the file will be in the description section below with other social media you can follow containing much more content. Catch you guys next time, and stay tuned for more.